Is Biden intentionally trying to collapse the United States dollar? I'm going to go over some shocking intel in this video that is going to absolutely blow your mind. We're going to do this in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over the petrodollar and its relationship to what just happened in Afghanistan. It all starts in 1974. The U.S. goes to Saudi Arabia and says, listen, guys, we need to cut a deal. Here's what it's going to look like. We want you to price your oil in dollars. So whomever you sell it to, you could sell it to a Japanese entity or maybe Argentinian entity. You need to require that they pay you in dollars for that barrel of oil. And in return, we're going to give you military protection. So let's think about what this would do for the United States dollar. All of these countries around the globe and entities, corporations that need oil to survive would have to first come up with dollars. Well, that's going to create massive amounts of artificial demand for dollars outside of the United States. If there's artificial demand, this props up the value that allows the United States to run huge deficits, not only budget deficits, but trade deficits, the twin deficits that Jeff Gundlach has been talking about recently. It also allows us to have artificially low interest rates inside the United States. We can spend more money. We can create a welfare and warfare state, and it artificially props up the standard of living. Because those automobiles or those homes, you can get them at a very low monthly rate because of the artificially low interest rates. Stocks, interest rates go down. The PE goes up, therefore the price of most stocks go up. And the cost of goods and services, because we can run such massive trade deficits, we can import a lot of, or most of the goods that we consume in the United States, keeping the prices low. So let's get a visual of how this plays out. We've got your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam. Going back to the 1970s, this was Richard Nixon. His good pal, Henry Kissinger. They go down to the Saudi royal family, to a gentleman named Muhammad Mike. Probably not his real name. And they said, listen, we will go ahead and give you all the military support you want, the planes, the bombers, the soldiers, the guns, the tanks with these American flags on them. All you have to do is sell your oil for dollars. So Muhammad Mike has a customer way over here in Japan, we'll say. His name is Miyagi-san, and he says, Miyagi-san, instead of taking those yen that I've been taking for so long, unfortunately now I need you to pay me dollars. So Miyagi-san has to come up with those dollars to get the oil that he needs from Muhammad Mike. Well, he's got a couple different options here. First, he can sell all of these cheap goods to the United States so they can run a huge trade deficit, and he can take those dollars from the American citizens that aren't producing as much as they consume. So they need to import those products that they can't produce or aren't willing to produce here in the United States. So then those dollars would go down to Miyagi-san, and he can use those to buy oil. His other option is to take the yen, go into the FX market, and trade those yen for dollars. Well, that creates more demand for dollars and then more supply of yen. So what does that do to the cross rate between the dollar and the yen? The dollar would go up in value, the yen would go down. This is what artificially props up the United States dollar and allows us to do all these things that we were talking about earlier. Most specifically, run the huge twin deficits, the trade deficit and the budget deficit. So your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam can keep rates artificially lower. They can borrow at a very low rate, let's just say 1%. This allows them to send out stimmy checks and all of the funny money to the individuals in the real economy so they can consume more than they produce. But let's just think about this. If the cycle were to reverse and interest rates were to go to their natural level, just for the sake of this example, let's say that's 10%. Just think about how much less welfare, warfare spending, and how it would decrease the standard of living right here in the United States. But to get a better idea of how this petrodollar system actually works, editor, let's go right to the internet. Okay, this is Investopedia. Through bilateral agreements with Saudi Arabia, beginning in 1974, the U.S. managed to influence members of OPEC to standardize the sale of oil in dollars. In return for invoicing oil in dollar denominations, Saudi Arabia and other Arab states secured U.S. influence in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, along with U.S. military assistance. Out of this mutually beneficial agreement, the petro system was born. But now let's go over what's happening with the petrodollar system right now, as we speak in 2021, that could have been triggered by the debacle in Afghanistan. Next, we go to an article from BreakingDefense.com from September 1st, 2021, Beirut, when the deputy defense ministers from Russia and Saudi Arabia signed a new military cooperation agreement last week. It served as not just a sign of growth between the two governments, but also as a clear signal from Riyadh, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It is willing to diversify its defense, in other words, its military relationships, beyond its longtime focus on the United States. So if it diversifies its defense relationships, it could also be diversifying the amount of oil that it sells in dollars. And this could lead to them abandoning the entire petrodollar system. And let's remember, the catalyst could have been Afghanistan. So what we see now as a result of the debacle in Afghanistan is the Saudis looking elsewhere for their military protection, more specifically, Russia. So if they're going to Russia for their military protection in the future, that means they don't need the military protection that was being provided to them by the United States. But remember, that was part of the deal. That is what incentivized the Saudis to price their oil in dollars in the first place. So if there's no military protection, why on earth would the Saudis continue to price their oil in dollars? Why wouldn't they start pricing it in rubles? And I'm not saying this all falls apart overnight, but this is one step closer to the de-dollarization of the global oil market. And if we're one step closer to the de-dollarization of the global oil market, we are one step closer to the collapse of the petrodollar system, which would make this whole process work in reverse. Now, all of a sudden, Miyagi-san doesn't need dollars. Therefore, he doesn't have to transfer or trade his yen for dollars on the FX market, propping up the dollar and allowing us to have artificially low interest rates, which gives us an artificially high standard of living. So standards of living decrease, interest rates go up, fewer stimmy checks go out to the average Joe. Then Miyagi-san can decide whether or not he wants to sell those goods to the United States. Maybe he wants to export them somewhere else, or maybe they want to consume them right in Japan, in their home country, to get prices down for their consumers. And let's think this through to the next step. If they decided to import fewer goods to the United States, that means that we would need to produce those goods here. That would drive the cost sky high, producing much higher rates of inflation, therefore a collapse of the dollar against goods and services here domestically in the US economy. So the bottom line is, if the petrodollar collapses, the United States dollar could also collapse. Then we have to think through, if what happened in Afghanistan was intentional. And I'm not saying that it is. But if you look at what happened, it doesn't make sense. And I'm not the only one with this view. Editor, let's cut to a clip of my recent interview with one of my favorite macro thinkers, Luke Gromen.
The U.S. intelligence establishment knew where the Taliban was. It was preposterous to think that they were surprised at what was happening. There was like only one road in and out. We have satellites covering the place. We knew what's coming, who's coming. What's more, we've known for a long time that the Pakistani government has been funding the Taliban for a long time, back to like 30 years ago. We've known that. The United States government, I didn't realize this, Logan made the point that the United States government gives the Pakistani intelligence services like $3 or $4 billion a year.
Wow.
And they're supporting the Taliban, and we knew they were coming. And so you go and you say, okay, so we know they're coming, but we act like we don't. We have the ability to shut off, right, this dollar system, this dollar system that we can weaponize, that we have weaponized over and over and over. And you hear all the dollar bulls say, you know, we can weaponize this anytime we want. And I agree. I'm the first person to agree. Why didn't we stop remittances out of the United States to Pakistan? It's very easy to do. Go to the SWIFT, shut it off. Why are we giving $3 to $4 billion a year to Pakistani intelligence services when they're supporting the Taliban? If the story as we're told is true.
Right.
And so the only conclusion you come to is that there's something we're not being told. And there's something very big and foundational, first principle about this whole setup that we're not being told.
So if the way the United States pulled out of Afghanistan was intentional, and I'm not saying it is, I'm just saying we have to think through the probabilities. So if it was intentional, that would lead you to the conclusion that maybe, just maybe, they wanted the Saudis to go to Russia for their military protection. And then the next step, if they wanted that, then you would have to conclude that your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam, or the Biden administration, also wanted the Saudis to price their oil in a currency other than the dollar. And then, of course, the next step is if they want those two things, obviously they want the petrodollar system to collapse, which would give a massive, massive tailwind to inflation and could potentially collapse the United States dollar. We're going to be going over a lot more intel just like this, but in order to connect the dots at the end and put all the pieces of the puzzle together, I want you to put one thing in the forefront of your mind. You might even want to write this down. We've got a timeline starting in 1944. What do you think happened in 1944 that is so important to the topic that we're discussing in this video, the petrodollar? Bretton Woods. Then in 1971, we came off the gold standard. Like we said earlier, 1974, we had the petrodollar agreement go into effect. But in the interim, what was established? Something called the IMF. We're going to talk more about that in step number 3. Also an idea from Keynes called Bank Corps, and we had Triffin's dilemma. This is the idea that if we use one country's sovereign currency for the global reserve currency, it will create a house of cards that inevitably, at some point in time, will all come crashing down. Step number 2, the MMT president. And I want to point out that Biden obviously is a president who believes in this philosophy of modern monetary theory, but he just took the reins from Donald Trump. I don't want to let him off the hook. Trump was the original MMT president, but that goes down a completely separate rabbit hole. So we know Joe Biden has adopted the policies of MMT hook, line, and sinker. And a lot of these ideas come from an economist named Stephanie Kelton. And I also want to point out, we'll get back to this momentarily, that AOC has gone on record saying that MMT is fantastic. She has adopted it and she sees it as a way to pay for the Green New Deal. Biden has insinuated this as well. But let's kind of just do a quick review of MMT to make sure we're on the same page. Kelton would argue that the government is a currency issuer. They are not a currency user. So you can't look at the way the real economy works or the way the balance sheet works for a business or the average Joe and Jane because they're a currency user. So the balance sheet of the government is literally infinite. They can spend as much money as they want. They actually create the dollars and spend them into existence. There is no constraint on government spending whatsoever. So in theory, the government doesn't even need to issue or sell bonds, treasuries. Why? When they could just create the money by spending it into existence. And if they don't need to sell bonds or treasuries to generate revenue, if they have a deficit, then there's no reason whatsoever for them to collect taxes. Why on earth should they collect taxes when the government, according to Kelton, and let's remember that Biden and AOC have adopted these ideas 100%. But why should the government collect taxes when they are a currency issuer? There's no need for them to collect revenue or dollars at all because they're the ones who create the dollars, again, by spending them into existence. But there is one minor problem that even Stephanie Kelton would admit to. That is consumer price inflation. As most of you can imagine, if the government is spending, making it rain all of these dollars on the real economy, at some point, there's going to be too many dollars for the amount of goods and services, and the prices of the stuff is going to go up. That's a problem. But Kelton has a solution. All we need to do is then tax people an appropriate amount to get those dollars out of the system and back into the government, where poof, they're magically gone. They vanish once they go to the government. So, just a crude example here. We've got $1, $2, $3, $4, $5, $6, $7, $8 going into the system. If they see inflation getting out of hand, running hot, then they'll say, oh, we just need to increase taxes a little bit. And if we increase taxes, then we'll pull 3 of those dollars out of the system. So there will only be $5 circulating in the real economy, chasing goods and services. This will create the downward pressure on consumer price inflation and get the genie back into the inflationary bottle. So they think. Whoa, time out. I know a lot of you that are really paying attention right about now are kind of scratching your head and saying, okay, George, I get it, but if Biden and AOC, who is wearing a tax the rich dress, is coming out and saying that they believe wholeheartedly in MMT. That's how they're going to finance the Green New Deal. So if they believe in MMT, and they also believe that inflation is transitory, both of them, Biden and AOC, have come out and said, oh, there's no need to worry about inflation. In fact, you can see Joe Biden is here holding a sign that says no inflation, as is AOC. Now, unfortunately, she is spelling it INNFLASION. Might have to get Miss AOC some spelling lessons. But regardless of the fact that she can't spell inflation, it doesn't get around the fact that she's been preaching that inflation isn't an issue. Well, hold on a minute here. If they believe in MMT, that the government is the issuer of currency, therefore they're never constrained. They don't have to raise money through the selling of bonds and collecting taxes. And the only reason they would need to collect taxes or increase taxes on the rich is if we had inflation. Then how can they argue that we need to increase taxes on the rich? Those three ideas cannot coexist if you're being intellectually honest. So what does that mean? It means that Biden and AOC and anyone else that believes in MMT and doesn't believe that we have an inflation problem and is arguing that we need to increase taxes on the rich doesn't care about the poor at all. That's not why they're saying tax the rich. They're not saying tax the rich to help the poor. The only objective they have is just to hurt the rich. So I think both Biden and AOC at best are being disingenuous. And more accurately, I think they're just a fraud. They're sitting here telling you that they want to help the poor, but they just want to hurt the rich and further their own political career by trying to pander to their constituents because they think you are too stupid to connect the dots between MMT, inflation, and increasing taxes on the rich. Now let's go back to MMT's fatal flaw. Got a chart here starting at 1945 going all the way to 2014. On the left, we have the percentage of tax revenue to GDP. So if GDP is $100, let's say, and the government collects $20 in taxes, that would be 20% of GDP collected in tax revenue. So that's what this chart is illustrating. And editor, go ahead and throw up the actual chart. You can see it kind of goes up and down, but I just drew this blue line to give us an average of about 18%. So let's think this through. Going back to 1945, the 50s, the 60s, tax rates on the rich were extremely high, upwards of 90%. And then in the 1980s, let's call it right around here, rates went all the way down to maybe 25 or 30%. So regardless of whether the top rate was 90% or 25%, what happened to tax revenue as a percentage of GDP? It doesn't really change at all. So if the amount of dollars that are being sucked out of the system by tax collection are very consistent, then how would the MMTers propose that they suck those dollars out of the system if inflation starts to run hot? Let's go over this one more time to make sure we're all on the same page. Kelton, Biden, and AOC believe that the government can create as much money as it wants. And the only constraint is inflation. And if they see inflation, they can just increase tax rates on the rich that will suck dollars out of the system and put downward pressure on consumer price inflation. But what history shows us is that regardless of where the tax rates are, they can be at 90%, they can be at 25%, the government still collects the same amount of money as a percentage of GDP. And if the government is collecting the same amount of dollars, it's pulling the same amount of dollars out of the system, regardless of what that highest marginal rate would be. Therefore, just by increasing the marginal rate doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be pulling more dollars out of the system. So if you can't pull more dollars out of the system, then there's absolutely no way for the MMTers to fight inflation. This brings us to another tailwind for the collapse of the dollar based on Biden's policies of the twin deficit. His policies of massive deficit spending, in addition to creating an environment in the United States where we have to import more and more goods from other countries because we're not producing them here, taking our trade deficit to all-time highs. This is a textbook recipe for collapsing a currency. Step number 3, the World Economic Forum, the IMF, and Biden. Let's go over the connection. In step number 1, we talked about how Biden, whether it's intentional or unintentional, could be destroying the petrodollar. In step number 2, we talked about how he is an MMT president. There's no disputing that. He's running massive budget deficits and also trade deficits, giving a huge tailwind to inflationary pressures that could collapse the dollar. But these attacks on the dollar are just the beginning. Let's remember that Biden has recently come out with a cerveza sickness plan. And I don't want to go over the whole entire plan, but let's go over the first talking point. And I got to keep this YouTube friendly. So it requires, or has a certain requirement for businesses over 100 employees. I think you guys know exactly what I'm referring to. But let's remember that he's introducing these requirements in a very tight labor market. What I mean by that is very few times in American history have employers been more in need of employees than right now. The last number that came out, if my memory serves me right, and editor, help me out with this one, about 11 million job openings in the United States right now. So let's think this through. What he's doing is reducing the labor pool by creating an additional requirement for businesses. Right here we have business XYZ, and as you can tell, they've got a help wanted sign right in the front. And the entrepreneur involved is Job Creator Joe, probably the cousin of the average Joe. There are a lot fewer Job Creator Joes, unfortunately, than there are average Joes. But the government comes in and says, listen, Job Creator Joe, you need to give all of your employees this required stuff. We'll call it. And Joe says, oh my gosh, I already don't have enough employees. How can I afford to lose some of the great employees I already have? Let's say he started off with 3 employees, or maybe 300 would be a better example because the requirement as of right now is 100. But Job Creator Joe is definitely going to have some employees that don't want to go along with the requirement. So he starts with 300 employees, but now let's say he only has 200 employees, but he originally had a need for 400 employees. That's why he had the help wanted sign in the first place. So what is he going to do initially? He's going to increase wages to try to bring in those employees who are currently unemployed. But unfortunately, contrary to popular belief out there in the mainstream media, businesses don't have infinite margins. So let's just say Job Creator Joe is running at a 10% margin. Well, usually 40% of your overall expenses will be payroll. So how is he going to afford to increase wages to a significant degree if he only has a 10% margin? Because at some point in time, there isn't going to be any margin left over. Then he's only going to have one option and one option only. That is to increase prices. So when you combine this with all the other inflationary pressures we've been talking about, that's going to take consumer prices to infinity and beyond. They're going Buzz Lightyear. And this, of course, is going to give another tailwind to the dollar collapsing in value relative to those goods and services. But let's go back to the title of this video. Is Biden intentionally trying to collapse the dollar? It's not Biden is trying to collapse the dollar. So I have to answer the question. And if you had to put me on the spot right now, my answer to you, the viewers watching this video, would be no. I do not think that Biden is intentionally trying to collapse the dollar. Why? Because even if he wanted to, I don't think he's smart enough. And this is really the key. To understand what I'm talking about, editor, let's go right to the internet. This blog post is on the World Economic Forum's website. It's titled, "A Digital Currency Should Be Adopted as the World's Leading Reserve Currency." In other words, replace the US dollar. I also want to point out, before we move any further, that the URL that the World Economic Forum came up with is from dollar to ESDR. And I've read so many of their articles, and what I've noticed is a lot of times they'll come up with a title that's like from the dollar to the ESDR that is extremely unpopular, and they'll get a lot of pushback and negative press, especially on social media and YouTube, and then they'll change the title of the blog post or the article, but you usually see the original in the URL. Just FYI when you're doing your own research. In step number 1, we talked about Triffin's dilemma. Basically, this states that if there is one country that has the global reserve currency, it is totally unsustainable. So in this blog post, they reference Triffin's dilemma as a reason why the dollar should not be the global reserve currency. Here we go. Of course, Triffin's dilemma can be avoided, and America's outsized influence over the monetary system reduced. All that is needed is a major reserve currency that is not issued by a national authority. And I know a lot of you watching right now will get a kick out of this next sentence. Gold once supposed to fill this role, but it couldn't meet demand for global liquidity and a store of value. How on earth can they argue that gold could not fill the role of being a store of value? Unbelievable. But let's get back on track. So if they're saying the dollar can no longer be the world reserve currency and gold just won't work, what do they suggest? Well, here we go. A better option is the IMF's special drawing right, the SDR. But let's think about this for a moment. They're talking about how they need to get rid of the dollar because America has outsized influence over the monetary system. And if it has outsized influence over the monetary system, it has outsized influence over the entire world. But they are wanting that outsized influence to go from the United States to the IMF. And as you know, the IMF and the World Economic Forum are basically tied at the hip. So remember, at the beginning of the video, I went over this small timeline, 1944 to 1974. And I told you to write down 3 things. IMF, Bancor, which turned out to be what? SDRs, special drawing right, the currency of the IMF, and Triffin's dilemma. What I illustrated in the reading is part of their argument for abandoning the dollar as the world reserve currency is because of Triffin's dilemma. But I think it's also because of control and power that it gives the central planners. So we've got Klaus Schwab right here in charge of the World Economic Forum, everyone's favorite organization. And he's got his cat, Mr. Bigglesworth. So he is saying dollar is bad. SDR is good. It's exactly what they are saying in that blog post that we read from the World Economic Forum. But let's think this through. We realize the central planners want to replace the United States dollar with a digital SDR. But let's go back to the exorbitant privilege the dollar gave the United States. That's what we were referencing in step number 1 earlier in the video. So if the global reserve currency goes from the United States to the IMF and the World Economic Forum, and I'm putting them together because basically they're tied at the hip, very similar to our federal government and Goldman Sachs. But if the world reserve currency goes from the United States to the central planners at the IMF and the World Economic Forum, so is all of the power, control, and global dominance. So I think there is a possibility, and again, there are no certainties, there are only probabilities. But I think the probability is far higher than 0 that Biden is simply a puppet. He's a useful idiot. And the people who are really pulling the strings to get the power, the control, and the global dominance are the central planners at the IMF and the World Economic Forum. Is this their intent? I don't know. Maybe. But do they have an incentive? Absolutely. And as Charlie Munger famously said, show me the incentives and I will show you the outcome. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.